Hello, hello to another short story. Today I have a bit of a longer short story for you, and a story that I'm pretty sure you haven't heard nor read yet, unless, that is, you own a copy of Book of Squalor by Max Rudd, because this is where this story is from. Max was kind enough to give me permission to narrate this amazing weird fiction story. I have to say it is one of the most atmospheric weird fiction stories that I read in the last weeks. I enjoyed it tremendously, and I was honestly surprised by the ending of the story. I wouldn't have guessed that, and I'm very curious to reading your thoughts in the comments. And if you're interested in more of Max's stories, you can find links to the book, of course, also to Max's website, Xadrum, and his YouTube channel, also Xadrum, in the description. With all that having said, I honestly hope you will enjoy the story at least as much as I did when reading it. Here we go. Trucks by Max Rudd. Still here? Paul Keeley breathed with a satisfied smile. Expertly molding tobacco into rolling paper for the fourth time in under an hour, Paul scanned the disused Monsieur Marché supermarket, eyes bright as he wetted the gummed strip. Memory lapped around him as he surveyed the building in the near distance. He lit his roll up, inhaled deeply, and blew out a cloud of bluish smoke. Gorgeous July sun inebriated the air, and the exhalation from Paul's lungs drifted leisurely away. Looking further along and over the road, he saw L'Octroi, one of the many cafes where he and his friends had used to drink. Mounted over the cafe's entrance was a large digital clock which alternated between time, 1455, and temperature, 32-33 degrees Celsius. Just right for the Vendée. 5 years had slipped away since Paul had left France and returned to England. Naturally, he had come back to visit his parents, but it hadn't been the same. They had moved to Rochefort not long after he had gone. Visiting family was all well and good, but coming back to Le Herbier made it feel like his first proper trip back. Glancing back at the clock, Paul reminded himself that he had to meet Pierrick at 3:30, an old school friend. Pierrick was delighted to have Paul staying with him, but even the occasion of his visit couldn't halt everyday life, and Paul had had to amuse himself while Pierrick was at work. Cigarette in mouth, Paul removed his jacket and hung it over his shoulder. Reaching behind his head, Paul extricated his long blonde hair from under his jacket and let it hang down. Thick and straw-like, his hair extended halfway down his back. He had received several odd stares from locals as he wandered the town. Recognition? Maybe, but more likely due to his attire. Boots, tight black jeans, and his favorite white zombie t-shirt, the ensemble finished off with his leather jacket, pockmarked with badges and patches of many other metal bands. Even after half a decade, such sights seemed to attract disparaging attention in rural France. Paul swung his legs over the low concrete wall which separated the pavement from the car park of the former supermarket, and, walking parallel with the road, wandered over to the remains of the supermarket service station. Unchanged from when he had lived here, steel uprights still supported the corrugated iron canopy under which the petrol pumps had once huddled. Even 5 winters had done little to weather them. Perching himself on the same low wall, which also ran alongside the canopy, Paul leant against one of its steel supports and gazed from the dilapidated supermarket to the curbed lanes of the service station beside him. A wry smile creeped about his lips, remembering the time that his mate Oliver, while skating, had broken his leg there for the second time. Shit Ollie had kicked up a fuss when Paul and the others had gone to get the firemen from over the road. He fancied he could still hear Oliver's squeals of pain as he'd been lifted onto the stretcher. Sod's law, though, Paul mused. It had been Ollie's birthday, after all. Stubbing his roll-up out on the wall, Paul got to his feet and started across the car park toward the empty Monsieur Marché store. There were only a couple of vehicles in the car park, which, since the disclosure of the store, had become a free parking zone, although Paul noticed, without much surprise, that since his departure a pay and display sign had been erected at the top end of the car park. He took the short journey to the rundown store laconically, whiling away the time in reminiscence. He had had some good times here with his group of friends collectively known as Les Skaters. Paul hadn't been a skater himself, but being the only English guy in town and a heavy metal freak was enough to grant him honorary membership. Skating was the focus of their existence, from clothes to music to their language, blatant American slang creeping into their native tongue. Hell, if he'd have learned that they slept with their boards, he wouldn't have been surprised. All this had stemmed from their collective passion. Paul could empathize. After all, hadn't music helped to shape who he was now? Considering this last thought, it dawned on Paul that it had been here in Le Herbier that he'd undergone his evolution, grown his hair, developed a fastidious preference for jeans and T-shirts, not to mention his near-fanatical devotion to anything black. It had been reflective of his outlook at the time. He had been 17 when they had moved from England, and Paul had hated it. At the school he'd been sent to learn French, they had soon started calling him Le Touriste, and they had been justified. He'd done bugger all for a year, and at the time he'd loved, no, been proud of it. He had been plain to his teachers at Lycée Polyvalent that Paul wasn't even trying to integrate, but he hadn't given a toss. He had known that when he'd got home it would be straight over to l'Ancien Marché, as they had called it, to see the guys and chill. Nearing the old building, Paul noticed that vandals had been at work here since he'd left. All but the 2 central storefront windows were now boarded up. Broken glass, inadequately swept away, still scattered the pavement before it. Adjusting his jacket to a more comfortable perch on his shoulder, Paul focused on one of the more outstanding items of graffiti spray-painted on the boarded-up windows. Spanning nearly 3 feet in bright red paint were the letters V.I.P. Paul grinned as he stepped up to the chipboard and ran his fingers over the frenetic artwork. "So, you finally got to leave your mark on the old place, huh?" he murmured. VIP, or VIP, had been one of Le Skaters. His real name was Vincent Pradel, as Paul recalled, but within the group he was always just VIP. They had got on well, the 2 of them, although Paul had never been totally convinced the VIP was fully in control of his faculties. After all, there was that time he'd shown up wearing a pair of huge sky-blue flares that he claimed to have made himself out of some old curtains. Paul, along with the rest of the guys, had nearly pissed themselves at the sight of their friend bombing down the car park on his board, bell-bottoms flapping in the wind. Shaking his head with a gentle smile, Paul cast an eye around Vip's handiwork, searching for the names of any of his other friends. Without success. Losing interest, Paul moved along the storefront to the remaining intact windows and stepped up to them. Cupping his hands over his eyes, he peered through into the gloomy, deserted shop floor. The sun's reflection off the window obliged him to strain his eyes to see, despite the limited protection given by his hands. Gazing at the far wall of the store, he could see the wide opening to what had once been the warehouse. Diffuse light from a number of ventilation holes near the roof of the corrugated iron-walled warehouse allowed Paul a partial view of its contents. Moving so close to the window that his nose crumpled against the glass, Paul's eyes lit up as he recognized one of the metal ramps le skaters had used to practice on. "Not after this long, surely," he whispered. Stepping away from the window, Paul stood drumming the baccy tin in his pockets, then produced from his pocket an impressive assortment of keys attached to his jeans by a length of chain. He sifted through them until he spotted the one that he sought, his own copy of the key to the warehouse door, located at the rear of the building. It took less than a second for him to decide whether or not to go inside, pausing only to check the time. 15:03, according to the clock. A good 27 minutes until he had to meet Pierrick. Paul set off around the side of the supermarket, now convinced that this was something he just had to do. The cracked, concreted backyard of the place hadn't changed much in his absence, except that there were more spurts of grass than he remembered, colonizing the narrow fissures crisscrossing the square yard. Around the far corner of the building from where he now stood, at the bottom of the fire escape, was where they used to sit and smoke endless fags and a fair few joints as well. He recalled that Vip used to produce puddles of spit as they talked. Once his friend's spitballs had littered the yard as fervently as the grass did now. Maybe Vip's saliva had helped it to grow. Now standing before the immense sliding steel door of the warehouse, he glanced around, checking for voyeurs as he inserted the key in the lock and twisted it. Nothing happened. Unperturbed, Paul tried again, remembering what a bugger the rustling lock could be. He heard the mechanism groan in response to his applied force, and with one good shove he managed to open the door enough to slip inside. Daylight spilled into the room, catching countless grains of dust in the act of drifting aimlessly. Pulling the door all but closed to further avoid suspicion, Paul surveyed his surroundings. To his right, some 15 feet above him, was the balcony, a concrete platform roughly 6 feet wide and 12 feet long, supported by 8 steel girders with painted metal railings along its edge and a loose chain bridging a gap in the railings in the middle. Looking up at it now, Paul wondered, as he had always done, what the balcony had been used for. There was no easy access to it from the ground level, and he couldn't conceive of anything worth storing that high off the ground. Le skaters and he had used to climb onto the roof of the small rectangular office directly across from where Paul now stood, and from there scramble up onto it. There wasn't much to do once up there. It just felt great being so high up and looking over the length of the warehouse, which was easily 50 to 60 feet long. The cool interior of the warehouse provided a welcome contrast from the blazing hot day outside. Glad of the change, Paul cast an eye over the rest of the space. Standing at odd angles to each other were 3 ramps, including the one he had glimpsed from outside. Their blue paint considerably more weathered than he remembered. Beside the nearest ramp lay a long-forgotten knee pad, soaked through from the puddle it inhabited. There had always been some water in here. It seeped in from the ventilation holes near the roof and formed shallow, stagnant pools across the uneven floor. Pulling out his baccy tin, Paul crossed to the office cabin opposite him. It looked like one of the building blocks he'd had as a toddler, yet somehow flimsier and painted a dusky green. It appeared out of place here. He paused to look it over. The cabin was divided into 2 rooms. Each was little more than a cupboard space, really. To the left was the office itself, small and dingy, where the skaters had stored their collection of skate magazines and spares for their boards, while to the right was the toilet, complete with knackered flush, bulbless light socket, and some tins of a nasty-smelling chemical that they had found. Stepping into the windowless office, he tried the light. Surprisingly, it still worked. Paul gazed at the few leftover magazines scattered about the small desk and floor, like an adolescent stash of soft porn, although, as this was France, such a thing as soft porn didn't exist, Paul reminded himself. Placing his tin on the desk, he picked up one of the mags with little interest. They all seemed the same to him, full of blokes on skateboards or blokes falling off of them and little else. Tossing the magazine onto the floor, Paul perched himself on the desk next to his tin, opened it, and rolled himself a cigarette. Chucks? No, trucks, he said with a frown as he sparked up. He knew it had something to do with the only morsel of skate jargon he could remember picking up. But what it was or meant escaped him. The notion of looking through the assorted magazines for the answer seemed too laborious to bother with. Paul shrugged and left the cubicle, glanced briefly into the toilet, then walked round to peer into the adjoining room. The bare floor space and the deceased store itself. There was little to see or capture his interest here, as the only light allowed in came through the 2 intact panes of glass in the shop front. Deciding that he'd spent enough time in the old place, Paul turned to go, then stopped and turned back, frowning. He surveyed the shop floor again. His eyes, becoming accustomed to the gloom, settled on a rectangle of light in the shadows along the far end of the left-hand wall. The upstairs offices of the store to which the open door led created a lowered ceiling over that side of the building which deepened the shadows more than necessary, in Paul's opinion. In puzzlement, he took a step in that direction. He knew the layout of the store quite well, and knew that the door was there. But what troubled him now was that the opening in question had been closed when he'd looked in that direction a second ago. He took a lungful of smoke and exhaled, encouraging his consternation to leave with it. Reminding himself of his impending meeting with Pierrick, Paul set off across the shop floor nonetheless. His footsteps echoed off the tiles underfoot. In the back of his mind more memories surfaced. He recalled having dreamt of winning the lotto and transforming this place into a metal club or venue. He'd have a huge stage in the warehouse and a couple of smaller ones in here. The bar would have been in the shape of a pentacle and would have been slapped in the center of the main room, where he could have looked down over it from the office above. Focusing on staying alert, he forced the memories back into the murk away from the surface. Reaching the door, he looked in. Daylight spilled through the long window on the first floor, where the stairs led. Glancing out of what remained of the storefront, he wondered if anyone returning to their car had seen him wandering around in here. Secretly, he hoped they had. Stepping through the doorway, he started cautiously up the tile-flagged steps. The air here seemed musty and still as he proceeded upward. Pausing halfway, Paul gazed out of the window on his right at the opticians adjacent to the store, where he had once taken his glasses while he'd still needed them to be fixed. Continuing on, he came to a rest on the top step, as another memory, more like a vision, flashed through his mind. He'd come up here once without the others. It had been the first and consequently the only time he had done so alone. He had stood close to where he did now and had been convinced that he had heard footsteps coming along the corridor around the corner from him. Of course, he'd known that that was impossible, dope-infused paranoia most likely, but it had unnerved him, and he had slipped quietly back downstairs and rejoined the others outside, saying nothing of his phantom experience. Shaking his head to clear it, Paul glanced around the enclosed landing, that same irrational feeling of vulnerability welling up inside of him as it had 5 years earlier. By his feet he spied a metal shaft, part of the handrail off the stairs. Swiftly he tied his hair back into a ponytail before bending down the scoop of the pole. He weighed it critically in his hand. A bit heavier than he would have liked, but not enough to hinder him if he needed to use it. "You're fucking insane, Keely," he whispered, hoping the sound of his voice would calm his nerves. It didn't. Even worse, he could hear soft footfalls along the corridor. A wave of panic washed over him, and he shot a glance down the staircase. The instinct to run, as he had before, was almost too strong to fight. Sweat beading on his forehead, Paul gripped the pole in his right hand, allowing his leather jacket to slide off his shoulder onto the floor. He crept to the edge of the wall. Around the corner he could still hear the soft, measured footsteps closing on him. Paul waited, back pressed against the bare wall, sweat seeping through his t-shirt, taking shallow breaths of the stagnant air which hazed his peripheral vision. He raised his makeshift club, ready to strike. For an instant the adrenaline made his knees feel unsure of themselves, and he steadied himself against the wall with his left arm. Licking his suddenly dry lips, Paul steeled himself and leapt round into the corner, swinging the pole before him. He shut his eyes and sighed in relief. The corridor was empty. Of course, it had to be, he was forced to admit. Leaning against the side wall of the corridor, he rubbed his hand across his eyes. "You twat," he exhaled reproachfully, shaking his head in disbelief at his own paranoia. For once he regretted having had a couple of joints before leaving Pierre's earlier. As could be seen from the main store below, this corridor ran the length of the shop floor, terminating with a single steel door near the rear. Along the right-hand side were 5 interconnected windowed offices. Paul returned briefly to the landing to reclaim his jacket before making his way along the corridor. Sauntering alongside them, he peered with little anxiety into each through empty window frames. All were bare, stripped of their furnitures, bar one, which still housed a filing cabinet, its top drawer half open. Stepping into the cubic office, Paul looked into the drawer. Empty. What a surprise, he thought. Aside from the few spiders and beetles he saw flitting industriously about, Paul felt certain now that he was the only living thing in the old place. Nevertheless, he kept the pole close as he calmed himself by rolling and smoking a small spliff. Disposing of the finished spliff in the open drawer, he clicked his fingers. Of course. Trucks, he said aloud. Wasn't that the name for skateboard axles? Happy at having remembered this, he wandered to the end of the corridor. The narrow passage continued for several feet beyond the glass partition of the end office, casting it into subtle shadow and terminating in the aforementioned metal door. Paul studied it. He remembered that it opened into a first-floor stockroom. It was nothing as voluminous as the veritable barn that was the warehouse, but it was the largest on this floor. He reached out and tried the door. It swung open a fraction. A vague sense of trepidation returned. In the past, this door had always remained locked. Exactly why he had never found out, but he was certain that he and Les Skaters had only ever been in there once. The owner had been having some work done and had left it unsecured when they went home. Perhaps the same has happened now, he reasoned. Even so, Paul half raised the pole before pushing the door fully open. It was just as he recalled. Marginally wider than the corridor and offices combined and almost as long, with a pair of metal doors at the opposite end. The room basked in muted daylight from 3 square, opaque plastic skylights. Grey linoleum clothed the floor. A section of it had been cut from the middle of the room and now lay rolled up neatly against the left-hand wall. Aging, flattened cardboard boxes littered the room under a thin layer of entrenched dust. Paul Keeley swallowed as his rationale about why the door was unlocked broke down. Gingerly he stepped into the room. The chamber felt cool. Unlike the big warehouse, the chill in here wasn't felt against his skin, even though he could feel the hairs along his forearms shifting faintly. No, this cold he felt in his breast, not dissimilar to the chill he got before contracting a cold. He shrugged into his jacket, calmed by the ruggedness of leather. Standing in the center of the room, Paul looked around warily, the windowless space making him edgy with each second that he remained, his momentary calm draining from him. Reason screamed at him to leave immediately, but this time Paul ignored his instincts and proceeded with feigned fortitude to the far end of the storeroom. His mind wandered in spite of his anxiety, images of loose skaters, drugs, alcohol, all manner of stupid stunts they'd pulled for no better reason than effect, and trucks passed across his mind. Unconsciously he stopped just short of the door, still lost in reminiscence. So many memories stemmed from here. Once he had never wanted to leave, wasting each day in indulgence, but he had left, ran back to the comforts of England and real life. In time he had all but forgotten about his friends, Vip, Stefan, Jerome, Nicholas, and the rest. Paul had secretly known all along the real reason he had returned to the jaded supermarket, but only now that he was here was he prepared to admit it. Guilt. If only he had written or phoned once or twice, God knows he had made enough fuss about getting everyone's contact details. Then maybe he would be somewhere with the lads, enjoying a cool beer right now, instead of standing in this husk of a building, alone. He slammed his fist hard against the door. Fuck! He spat as a tear squeezed out from his eye and weaved its way down his cheek. Shoulders sagging, he allowed his head to droop, resting it against the door. The pain from his still clenched right fist was acute, but even that could not distract him from the melancholy surging up inside. More tears fell, and his fist connected with the door for a second time. The vibrating metal rattled his head and echoed through the room. At the first sniffle he composed himself. Straightening up, he extricated a second-hand tissue from his pocket and blew his nose. Good job, no one's here to see me blub, he thought, as he dried his eyes, turning to leave the room. Paul froze. Across the room a figure had appeared, framed in the doorway by which he had entered. Despite the seeming innocence of the development, Paul stepped back, feeling himself press against the door handles. The motionless figure was thin enough to be more accurately termed gaunt, with a pale complexion. From the far end of the room there were few fine details that Paul could discern about the newcomer, and an uncomfortable sensation told him it was better that way. What he could see served only to aggravate the worrying sensation that now gnawed in his gut. The figure wore simple black trousers and shoes, a grey-white overall, similar to a lab coat over a white shirt. The lab coat appeared to have black lettering embossed on it, illegible to Paul at this distance. His posture was slouched, with arms hanging loosely, too loosely, Paul decided, at his side. "Who are you?" he called in his rusty French. There was no reply. Shifting his grip on the pole, Paul, the tendrils of unease creeping from his gut up to his throat, took measured steps toward the stranger. Still, the other made no motion. "I said, who are you?" Paul repeated, unable to keep a hint of apprehension out of his voice. Nothing but silence filled the air. His mouth was dry, and now, in the middle of the room once more, the Englishman swallowed hard. From here more could be seen. of his new companion. Expressionless panda eyes huddled beneath a weak brow. Short, curly black hair clutched at his scalp. In fear of a vigorous sneeze which could scatter it across the floor, his complexion seemed more pallid than merely pale. Paul paused mid-step and sniffed. The hint of an odor diffusing through the room. His face clouded momentarily. Warm bread? He knew it could be nothing else, but where the hell was it coming from? Well, there certainly wasn't any bread around here, warm or otherwise. Could it be coming from... Nah, don't be stupid, he thought. A billow of breath notified him that the temperature in the room was plummeting. The sound of metal scraping across stone shattered the leaden silence. Paul whirled around, moth-like, to the direction of the sound, cudgel raised and eyes wide and searching. The noise must have come from the warehouse, he assumed, as the pained screeching came again. Paul swallowed reflexively and, not forgetting the odd figure at his back, glanced between the closed doors which led to the warehouse and the stranger at the opposite entrance, who remained unmoved. The expected sound was known to Paul all too well. Someone was in the warehouse dragging the skate ramps about. Heavy moments of silence dripped by as Paul waited for further developments. Half-rooted to the spot, as incapable of movement as his lank companion seemed disinclined to it. A new sound echoed round the warehouse, vaguely muffled to Paul's ears. Nevertheless, he recognized the resonance of small wheels accelerating over concrete, then clashing with metal. A brief silence, then a reverberating thunk as the wheels landed back on the ramp. The sound was repeated, although somewhat further away. Someone was down there. But surely le skaters must have moved on by now. Maybe it was a new generation. There had been some younger kids hanging around in the last few months before he'd left. But if so, why couldn't he hear any voices? The noise continued, becoming increasingly infernal in its unchanging regularity, heckling his nerves. Paul shook himself, trying to kick-start his rage in an attempt to quell the apprehension within him, and advanced threateningly on the ever-stationary figure. "Tell me who you are, or I'll have ya!" Paul yelled, the pole gripped with both hands, ready to strike. The stranger merely raised his left arm and pointed past the confused Englishman. Stepping away from the figure, Paul glanced round, following the indicating arm. In horror he watched as the double doors at the far end of the chamber swung open on their own into the room. The din from beyond them now filled the air around Paul as his beleaguered mind whimpered unconsciously. He looked back to the strange youth. The figure's glazed blank eyes flickered between him and the open doorway. Once more Paul fought down the urge to bottle out and run. He wanted answers, and fleeing wouldn't provide them. Dry-mouthed, he moved away from the stranger, snatching one last look at the word emblazoned on his coat, which he could now discern as simply Monsieur Marché. Moving crab-like across the stockroom to avoid turning his back on the stranger, Paul's mind raced over what the word signified. The store had been closed a good 18 months before he had even moved to France. So what was this employee still doing here? In light of all that had transpired in the past few minutes, there was only one answer that the outer rim of reason would concede. He paused and looked at his stationary companion. "Are you?" he whispered. The other nodded slowly. Paul swallowed, stumbled back a few steps until his hand touched the cool metal of the door. Visibly shaking, he turned and looked down into the warehouse. Paul swallowed, stumbled back a few steps until his hand touched the cool metal of the door. Visibly shaking, he turned and looked down into the warehouse. He gasped as, from his vantage point in the doorway set some 20 feet above the warehouse floor, he quickly appraised the scene. His legs wobbled noticeably, and he leaned on the doorframe for support. The skate ramps had been indeed moved, and now stood in a line down the middle of the warehouse. The two nearest of him were arranged back to back, their tops creating a short platform. The third stood further away, almost parallel with the huge main door by which he had first entered, which now appeared to be firmly shut. The ramps were separated by a gap of some 10 feet. This arrangement of the ramps he took in at a glance. It was the figures now inhabiting the warehouse that absorbed his attention. They were 3. Les skaters, standing stock still in a line, 6 of them. Jerome, in his Thrasher t-shirt, it had been Paul's 18th birthday present to him. Stéphane and Jean-Jacques, 2 of the younger members of the group, stood beside him. Steph, as always, was holding his board behind his head, while JJ simply looked odd bereft of his pebble glasses. Oliver stood next to him, then Christophe. Paul had completely forgotten Christophe. He had been the youngest among them. He had been only 12 when Paul had left France, and yet here he was now, barely changed in his red hoodie. At the end of the line, standing next to his girl's bike, was Nicholas. He had been Paul's closest friend in the group, and, like himself, had been a non-skater. Paul slowly shook his head as he absorbed the eerie lineup. Each of them looked like the strange lad in the doorway, pallid and sullen-eyed, with near-lifeless limbs. For the most part, they held their boards loosely under their arms. Steph's board held against the back of his head seemed obscene in conjunction with his otherwise limp frame. Through scrutinizing his old friends, Paul had almost forgotten the continued racket caused by the solitary skater. It could only be Vip. Ceaselessly he sped across the warehouse floor between the opposing ramps, flew up into the air, turned, and landed. He repeated the action over and over again, seemingly oblivious to the third ramp and the platform created by its abutment to the second. The grotesque lineup of Les skaters observed his progress impassively, their slack hats swaying pendulously to and fro in time with his vitesse. Paul, too, watched him, his own head falling slowly, unconsciously into time with the others down below. Vip was attaining heights of nearly 10 or 12 feet with each jump, something beyond him. In life, Paul considered. This seemed the only epithet he could give, for clearly none of them were alive, Vip especially. In spite of the physical demands required to achieve the feats he was engaged in, he appeared as flaccid and lifeless as the others, his arms sweeping lollishly in reaction to his motion. Visibly shaking, Paul pressed one hand to his head to halt the hypnotic effect Vip was having on him. "Oh, Christ, no!" he breathed. The creatures in the warehouse appeared to hear him over the din and shifted their gaze to look at him. The swaying of their heads continued unabated. Even Vip raised his eyes to him, now almost on the same eye level at the apex of his jumps. The vapor of warm bread gorged his nostrils, playfully shrouding his taste buds with the texture of fresh baguette and causing Paul to swing round sharply. The strange youth now stood inches from him, staring into his face. Paul took a step back, tottering on the edge, 20 feet of open space between him and the warehouse floor. "What have you done to them?" he demanded. Again, no reply. The boy simply drifted forward, arms raised to push him out. Paul attempted to dodge round him, only to have the move countered. He misstepped and tumbled backward out of the door. With a desperate swing, Paul struck out at the boy with his kosh and succeeded in catching him on the side of the head. The blow enough to send the deadly youth staggering back into the room. Paul was falling. A brief rush of air as the ceiling sped away from him, and yet his brain still had time to consider it odd. How even this seemingly short distance caused the metal of his earrings to cool against the flesh of his lobes. Then pain. He felt his right shoulder shatter on impact. An agonizing scream crawled in his mind, which his winded body was unable to give voice to. Chaotic colors fleeted across his vision. By rights he should be out cold, but fear clung him anxiously on to consciousness. His head felt damp from the intermingling of malodorous tepid water and blood from a crack in the back of his head. His blood dripped from the knot of his ponytail, compressed beneath him. His pelvis and right leg began to numb, and still he could hear Vip skating on. The vibrations carried through the floor at his back added their own acute edge to the agony galloping through his nervous system. Movement was impossible, and all Paul could do was gaze up at the opening from which he had fallen. The boy appeared there and, without looking down, fell forward towards him. Paul tried to move his left arm to shield himself, the result being a half-formed, tormented yelp and the discovery of another pocket of pain. With arms stretched before him, the boy fell rapidly. Paul's only possible action was to shut his eyes in anticipation of the crush. It never came. The boy's open palms connected with the floor either side of Paul's head in the same instant as his upturned feet. Deceptively powerful limbs absorbed the force of the touchdown and brought the deceased boy's face so close to Paul's that their noses brushed lightly together. Warm bread again, enveloping the scent of Paul's escaping blood. He moaned softly as he heard the boy speak. Even as close as they were, no exhalation from the dead thing touched Paul's face. "We love this place. We stay. You will stay too, no?" The creature's French accent, a vague echo of its sallow voice. A second low moan escaped Paul's tremulous lips as he opened his eyes and looked at the face of his attacker. From this proximity he could trace the spider-web creases of the other's torn dead skin across his cheekbones. Where he had struck the monster with the crutchel, there was a sizable dent in the skull, unnoticed by the boy. "Please, let me go," Paul implored. The boy ignored him and rose to his feet. Reaching down, he grasped the lapels of Paul's leather jacket and lifted him single-handedly. Paul hissed as again pain consumed him, even though much of his frame had gone numb. The pole slipped from his grasp. Legs dragged uselessly across the damp floor. Paul let his head loll back and saw that he was being moved to the platform created by the two touching skate ramps. Powerless, he felt himself lifted onto it, his body so numb now that he barely registered the cold steel beneath him. His head tilted toward le skaters. "Do not worry," the boy whispered close to his ear. "Nicholas was reluctant too, but we, comment dites-vous, we persuaded him." Paul focused on his deceased friend, who returned the gaze. It was only now that Paul could distinguish a deep indentation in Nicholas's forehead. The wound showed no sign of having healed, and aside from its rather messy edges, the shape was unmistakable. Trucks. Some part of Nicholas's defunct senses seemed to react to the revulsion evident in the prone Englishman's expression. With sickening slowness, his still pendulous head twisted into a smile. Paul felt his stomach heave even as the front of his jeans darkened and dampened. He thought of screaming again, but knew no one would hear. Noise and vibration ripped through him as Vip once again mounted the ramp closest to his head and launched himself high into the air. The boy gripped Paul's neck and with one swift motion slid him forward so that his head fell over the edge onto the scoop of the ramp. Paul felt nothing as his head connected with metal. Frozen and broken, unable to even muster power to close his eyes, he watched as Vip arced high above him, then began his descent, board angled with practiced precision at his forehead. All eyes were trained on Paul as the trucks struck home.